to Next Round with the Pacific Research Institute. I'm your host, Rowena Itcham. This week, our guest is Steve Greenhut, veteran journalist and R Street Institute's Western Region Director. Tim Anaya, PRI Senior Director of Communications, and I chat with Steve about all things California politics, from the way Governor Newsom is handling the coronavirus crisis using his executive powers, how the legislature advancing its progressive agenda, the role of police unions in curbing abuses, and finally, the initiatives on the November ballot. He also gives us a sneak preview of his upcoming book, Winning the Water Wars. Thanks for joining us. Welcome back to PRI's podcast, Steve.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
So we're about to enter the final month of a legislative session that's been dominated by the coronavirus. There's been a lot of criticism that the legislature has abandoned their role this year, giving a blank check to Governor Newsom and his executive powers. How do you assess the legislature's role in the COVID-19 crisis? And do you think they've provided enough oversight of the governor's actions? And have they been more of a help or a hindrance to California struggling to make ends meet?
I think the California legislature certainly reinforces that the cliche about your liberty and your money is never safe when a legislature is in session. And they seem to have been taking the opportunity to promote a lot of their pet projects. But I don't think they've exerted their legislative authority sufficiently to control the governor. I mean, these are uncharted waters, I suppose, where we have this coronavirus crisis and the governor has vast executive powers. Legislators have made noises about controlling the governor, but they haven't really done anything about it. And ultimately, the power rests in the legislature. They could rein in the governor if they wanted to, but we haven't seen, other than a bit of grumbling and a focus on a scandal or two. I don't think they've done much. And I'm looking right now at a Los Angeles Times editorial, and the Times obviously has a liberal editorial board, and its headline was "Time to Cut Off Governor Newsom's Blank Check." That was from May, but I don't see that anything has greatly changed since May, and it seems to reinforce the views that a lot of us have, that there's just haven't been enough checks on these, what they call the open-ended emergency declarations, and they'd prefer to see some restrictions in place for the next pandemic or natural disaster. I think that would be, I'm not sure exactly what those restrictions, what form they would take, but since May, obviously we had a reopening of sorts, and now we're having a clampdown again, and my fear is that we're just going to see this type of thing go on, and there ought to be some clear limits on what the governor can do. I mean, we're a society based on checks and balances and a disbursement of power, and there's a reason that we don't just give one person, power to just make all sorts of decisions, because individual leaders are not best able to decide what's best for everybody. So the Times argued that Newsom has done a pretty good job. I'm not sure I've reached that conclusion, but even though they like the job he's done, they believe there ought to be limits on power, and I think there really should be.
Let's talk about Governor Newsom. Many observers gave him early praise for his leadership on the coronavirus, but we've seen criticism mount as we're now entering a fifth month of restrictions on much of the economy and our normal way of life. The governor has received sharp criticism from all corners for his controversial nearly $1 billion no-bid mass deal with a Chinese firm. There's been a lot of debate about the governor's use of executive powers, as you just mentioned. So how do you rate Governor Newsom's job performance on COVID-19?
I have a hard time rating any of the governors. I don't think they've, in general, I'm uncomfortable with having governors or presidents have the amount of power that they have. So even though he started out, I cut him a lot of slack in my newspaper writing. I took a go slow approach. I wasn't too critical at first, but when we got into the thick of it, I was pretty critical because a lot of the edicts seemed to be arbitrary. And the governor, he talks a good game about local control and regionalism. We look at how he handled that, though. He was fine with regionalism as long as the regions did exactly what he said. And I write for the Orange County Register, and there was when we had the beach closings, which seemed arbitrary, and then there was a reopening, and there was a photograph that appeared to show crowded beaches and people perhaps not following social distancing, and then he immediately rescinded those openings. And yet the police department in Newport Beach issued a statement saying that people were following social distancing. So this is the problem you get when you have when governors have so much power. They can see a picture and then they can react in the way they did. So a lot of this seems arbitrary. He hasn't been respecting the locals. I mean, Siskiyou County or Modoc County, where at one point I don't think there were any cases up there. It's not San Francisco. It's not Los Angeles. Our state is 800 miles long, and we have remote counties with very few people in them. And we have, Los Angeles County is more populous than 40 or 41 other states. One size doesn't fit all. So if we believe in localism, we need to allow locals to make decisions, even if those decisions aren't the ones that the leader would like. So I haven't been pleased overall, but it's hard to know what could have been done dramatically different. But I tend to believe that the state has a role in setting some general guidelines and then allowing businesses and localities to enforce those things on their own. So that's the problem I see. So I haven't been happy with what he's done, but I can't really look at any other governor I see who I've been thrilled with either. I just think it's the nature of the problem here that we've given our governors everywhere too much power.
So following on that, throughout this pandemic, there's been a big debate over the power of state and local officials to force Californians to close their businesses, reduce their regular activities, and stay at home. Several lawsuits were filed challenging the various executive orders and public health orders. Counties with low COVID-19 cases even went rogue, as you say, and started to loosen restrictions without the governor's okay. In your view, has there been too much government overreach during this crisis? And what's the proper role for state and local governments in response to a pandemic and should we enact limits on government power?
We definitely need to have limits. And what point is the Constitution or any of the limits on government power we have when we jettison them as soon as there's some sort of crisis? Some of these edicts have been problematic, the ones that limit church get-togethers and church singing. Meanwhile, we look at how the state has handled its own facilities, the ones where they have total control over, such as, within the prison system. And we've seen terrible results in state prisons and jails. So a state that can't even manage the situation in its own wholly controlled facilities, you can't begin to believe that they're going to know what's best for every business. So my view on the role is that the state would set some temporary general constraints, like, okay, you can mandate social distancing, suggest mask wearing, those sorts of things, but not decide which businesses can stay open and which ones can close. When I go out and about, and I try to do it as little as possible, given how miserable it is to go anywhere anymore, but businesses have done all sorts of things. They've got these big plastic shields. They have their own rules. They enforce some of these social distancing rules. So let local knowledge prevail. Let local governments decide what needs to be done. We're not going to like everything that local governments do, but it's far better. I'm in Sacramento County to have Sacramento officials determine this rather than state officials. I think that's the general framework that the state isn't following. They're just following whatever the experts say, and the experts are, the governor and his inner circle decide. That's what we decide. So we're opening again, and now we're closing again. That's the problem I see. So when I read the governor's reopening document back after the first round of the shutdowns were coming to a halt, it was totally open-ended, and it it was total, you look at the things that were in there, and they weren't firm guidelines. They were just general guidelines, which meant that they were at the service of the leadership. So there wasn't an easy way for anyone to determine how their business might open. And we're seeing a great deal of pain in the economy. Small businesses are obliterated. It seems unfair that I can go wait in line at a big box store, but a small business that offers some of the same things, many of those are closed, and it's problematic. Instead, just have general guidelines and let the local businesses and the local governments, determine how to enforce those.
So COVID-19 obviously forced a significant writing of the state budget. In January, we started the year with the governor proposing a budget that they projected would have a significant surplus. We're ending the year with lawmakers having acted in June to pass a budget to close a $54 billion deficit. Many have argued that the budget enacted in June largely kicked the can down the road on tough budget choices. And for sure, we're going to have other budget action that'll have to be taken in August and going forward. What's your takeaway from the June budget enacted by lawmakers, and what additional budget changes do you anticipate will have to be made in the coming weeks and months? Do you think we might be on the path to a COVID-19 related tax hike?
I'm expecting proposed tax hikes, and this is my problem with California's government all the time, is that they always kick the can down the road. And this budget wasn't long ago, before COVID, that lawmakers were patting themselves on the back for their great fiscal responsibility. They built up the rainy day fund, they paid down pensions a little bit, but essentially they're spending as much money as they conceivably can, and they don't deal with any of the systemic problems, that are plaguing the state financially. So, the specific budget here, let's see, so there were 10% pay cuts, through furloughs and so forth for public employees, but then the governor's letting the public employees forego previously agreed upon withholdings for their retiree medical benefit. They're letting school systems, delay payments. They're tapping the rainy day fund, which that's why a rainy day fund is there, but they're not doing anything about the systemic problems. It looks like with the new round of shutdowns that we're gonna have some deep economic problems. The unemployment rate is, over 10%. Be interesting to see what happens with the housing market, which has been strangely enough booming because of reduced supply and pent up demand. But I was reading statistics showing that a large portion of mortgages are heading toward default. So what happens if the housing market falls? That's always a possibility. And then we can look at the rates of return on the pension funds, which are much lower than had been expected. The pensions have to meet a pretty aggressive 7% rate of return just to maintain the status quo, which is 70% funding levels, which is pretty poor anyway. So instead of fixing the pension system, Governor Newsom has totally ignored the pension system. We haven't had any attempted pension fix since Governor Brown's PEPRA in, 2013, and that was only extremely modest reform. I mean, they were good reforms, but they didn't really go particularly far. And the main goal of those pension reforms was to soften up the public for the Prop 30 tax increase. So yeah, getting back to your question, I imagine we're going to see proposals for tax increases. We're also going to see a lot of local tax increases. School districts and local cities are struggling, and they're going to have larger payments to the pension system. So I think we're seeing a round of proposed tax increase. So that seems to be California's way of dealing with any sort of financial problem, is to hammer taxpayers even more, even though we have the highest tax rates in almost every category of taxation.
That's right. And, it seems that many Sacramento policymakers have channeled their inner Rahm Emanuel this legislative session and didn't let a good crisis go to waste. So they pushed further legislation to restrict school choice and tried to repeal the state's ban on affirmative action. Talk about these measures and some other instances where lawmakers are more focused on pushing their political agenda than helping Californians in need.
Yeah, absolutely. It seems like with all the restraints gone, lawmakers are using it to promote rent controls. And there's that bill that would essentially have this forgive rent, but allow then would have the state provide tax credits to landlords and give tenants until 2034 to pay back their missed rent. So we're seeing those kind of proposals. Yeah, the effort to undermine Prop 209, the legislature, put that on the ballot. That's going to be on the November ballot, which is a ban on racial quotas in state hiring and university admissions. So they're certainly pushing the same progressive agenda that they've had, and using the new limits on power as a means to ram some of these things through. I'm sitting here looking at the California Chamber of Commerce's job killer list. There's a head count tax. There are all sorts of expansions of the workers' compensation system, new burdens on lenders, expanded leaves of absences that would be mandated on small and large employers, through the COVID pandemic. There's just one after another. Mandates for additional time off, an expansion of CEQA, the California Environmental Quality Act, a new employment leave mandate. So the state, instead of paring some of these things back, they're pushing further, and they're doing exactly what Rahm Emanuel suggested, is not let a good crisis go to waste, and they're certainly not letting this crisis go to waste. And back on the budget thing, they're not making any sort of real tough decisions or cutting anything. They're just expecting that the federal government will bail us out, which, given the political situation in Washington, that doesn't seem highly likely.
So aside from COVID-19, the other major story of the year is all of the social unrest following the death of George Floyd. One legislative issue that has followed from all of the protests and attention to that case has been efforts to reform policing policies. You've written that if lawmakers are serious about wanting to curb abuses in police departments across California, that they actually need to rein in the powers of the police unions themselves. Explain what you mean here.
Yeah, I've been writing about policing issues for years now, and the irony here is that the state's Democratic leaders they've been quite allied with the state's police unions. So, the Copley decision, it was that 2006, which shut police disciplinary records. It wasn't until 2018 that we finally got a new law, SB 1421, that opened some of these, disciplinary actions to public view. And then we got quite a few articles newspaper articles that showed why that was so important. There was the series on criminal cops, quite a few California former and current police officers who were actually convicted of crimes but are still on the job. And we have Javier Becerra, the state attorney general, who had resisted the implementation of that law. He's gone to court and lost repeatedly. Kamala Harris was closely allied with the police unions when she was attorney general. All of a sudden, we're hearing these same Democrats who have resisted open government and some of these reforms that would help spotlight the policing problem, all of a sudden are trying to claim that they're embracing the police reform mantle. Not that Republicans have been any better. I mean, Republicans, in my coverage of the legislature, when it comes to policing, they're almost as bad as the Democrats, sometimes worse. But I make the comparison to teachers' unions. So we all like teachers and appreciate the hard job that they do, but we also realize that it's nearly impossible, thanks to a bevy of teachers union approved restrictions, to get rid of a bad teacher. There was the Vergara decision in Los Angeles County, which ultimately was overturned at the higher courts, but it spotlighted the degree of grossly ineffective teachers in the classroom and how that hurt poor kids. And that's the result of the different seniority and job protections. I was years ago. I was on the Stossel show, where he showed a chart of what's involved in firing a bad teacher in the New York City school district, and he went through this chart, and the audience was laughing. And then he let go, and there were additional pages. It's just virtually impossible. That's why we have what's called the turkey trot, where the school districts can't fire their turkeys, so they trot off to other districts. It's the same thing in policing, and I've covered it. It's nearly nearly impossible to fire a bad or overly aggressive police officer, thanks to the Peace Officers Bill of Rights, which is the state law that gives police officers all sorts of procedural rights to delay any sort of disciplinary actions. And so the unions, they get meet and confer authority at the local level, and then the local collective bargaining agreements add additional layers of protection. So you can't really get rid of a bad police officer. The officer at the center of the George Floyd issue reportedly had 18 complaints filed against him before that. And I've seen it from my coverage at the newspaper, where even in egregious incidents, you just can't get rid of these police officers, short of them being convicted of a crime. And they're rarely convicted they're rarely prosecuted for abuses of power. So we need to get reforms. So one of the bills in the legislature would punt deadly force incidences to the state attorney general. But as we've seen in California, the state attorney general has been even more zealous about protecting police officers than the local agencies. So we need a variety of union reforms, because unions are that's the main source of the problem. There are a lot of other problems, militarization caused by the drug war, caused after 9/11, but unions remain an impediment to reform. And if we're going to reform, police departments, we need to start by getting rid of bad officers. And the way to get rid of bad officers who infect the entire department is to erode some of these union protections that make it so hard for police chiefs to get rid of these officers.
We started the year with the governor devoting his entire State of the State address to California's homeless crisis. So lawmakers intended to make the state's housing crisis a major priority, and there was still work to be done on PG&E bankruptcy and wildfire policy. These issues and others were largely set aside due to COVID-19. Talk about the unfinished business in these and other key areas that will seemingly await the legislature in 2021.
Yeah, it's pretty amazing that homelessness, which was the thing that we were all writing about, who even remembers that? And same thing with the PG&E bankruptcy. So, but I think the main issue that needs to be addressed are, the financial issues. The pension issue needs to be addressed, and we're going to see, the stock market has come back a bit, but it fell dramatically. CalPERS had lost $69 billion at one point. They've regained some of that, but their earnings are still low. The state has to deal with its debts and pension liabilities, retiree medical liabilities. These are real debt. Just because they're calculated in a crazy manner, they're based on a guesswork, based on an assumed rate of return on the investments. This is the key problem that has to be handled. And what we're seeing is local governments. This even before COVID hit, local governments were being hit with enormous new bills from CalPERS, from the California Public Employee Retirement System, and just like the school districts have been hit with these kind of increased costs because pensions are gobbling up ever larger portions of their budgets. So that needs to be reformed, and there's no appetite at the state level for it. Now, some localities are doing things like in Placentia in Orange County couldn't afford its fire contract anymore, so it created its own fire department, and they exited their Orange County Fire Authority contract. The county fire agency had provided fire services, but they exited the contract, and they have their own department, which actually increases staffing levels and response times, but it outsources the paramedic portion of it, and their new firefighters get a 401k plan rather than these unsustainable pensions. And if we look at the Transparent California, which has data on the size of these pay and benefit packages, that's the core problem, and that's why cities can't. That's why their budgets are getting obliterated. Why they're cutting other services, and we're seeing that in school districts too, which have an increasing amount of their budgets go to pay for pension costs. And school districts were complaining before COVID about a lack of money, even after several years of dramatic increases in their budgets. So until the state gets those employee compensation issues under control, that's an unresolved issue, and it's not going to get any better until the state deals with it. But the way the state deals with all these things is to wait until there's a crisis, raise taxes, call for more federal money.
Even with COVID-19, one issue that I would argue has overshadowed just about everything else this session is Assembly Bill 5, which puts strict limit on Californians' ability to work as independent contractors. You wrote that AB 5's steadfast supporters seem to believe that a non-existent high-paying job with union-level benefits is preferable to an actual job. So what is the future for this issue? Will COVID-19 finally get California Democrats to come to their senses? Will any of the so-called fixes that the legislature is kicking around really help workers? And when will voters finally rise up and say enough?
Yeah. Assembly Bill 5 was an insanely bad idea. It was based on the dynamics decision, California State Supreme Court in 2018, which created an ABC test for determining whether an employer can use contractor labor. Essentially, they can only use contractor labor if the contractor is not engaged in the prime business of the company. So in other words, Uber and Lyft, which were, the targets of this, they could hire a plumbing contractor to do work in the headquarters, but they couldn't hire drivers as contractors. So the idea, this was a big union priority, was to force these companies to pay benefits, hire these workers as permanent employees rather than as independent contractors. The problem with it, as many studies have shown, is most of these workers are, they don't want the full-time jobs. They use these Uber and Lyft and DoorDash and some of these other delivery platforms as fill-in work while they're pursuing other opportunities, and this eliminates their flexibility, and that's what a lot of these folks like. And a recent study from Seattle showed that these employees, although they're not overly well paid, they earn something like $23 an hour on average. So it's not bad work. Surprise, surprise. Instead of companies rushing to hire these folks, they've been laying off employees because they can't afford to hire them. And it hasn't only impacted, drivers, it's had an effect on the freelance economy. Writers have limits on how many articles they could write for one company. Musicians have lost gigs. It's really destroyed the creative economy. And a lot of the businesses that California officials are so proud of, the fact that we're, the heart and soul of the nation's tech economy. Well, a lot of these growing businesses have a contractor-based model. That's the new world we're in. We're not in a world of factory floors and cubicles. So instead of relenting, the legislature has, they keep adding different categories of exemptions to different favored, politically favored groups. They need to get rid of this law, but instead they wouldn't even suspend it, even during COVID. And think about that. People are losing their jobs. And here, instead of at least relaxing the rules throughout the coronavirus crisis, the governor pledged $22 million in enforcement action so they could arrest people who aren't following these new rules. So it's obliterated jobs at a time when people need jobs. It's also harming the delivery economy. And we're all supposed to stay home, right? And rely more on these delivery services. So instead, the Attorney General has filed suit against Uber and Lyft. Now there's an initiative on the November ballot that would exempt drivers. So that'll give us, seeing what the public does, that will give us a good sense of what average people are thinking about this issue.
So let's look ahead to November. Voters will have a chance to weigh in on several other important ballot measures. Talk about some of these measures, especially the ones in a recent column you called scary propositions.
Yeah, the worst one is the split rolls. That would split away the tax rolls and essentially remove Prop 13's property tax protections from commercial and industrial property owners. And it could raise, as much as $15 billion a year for the state. And the Attorney General wrote a title and summary that just it says increases funding for public schools. Makes it sound like such a nice thing to boost funding for schools. But what it's going to do is hammer property owners. And Prop 13, which was was passed in 1978, limits property tax at 1% of the assessed value of a property at the time of purchase, and it could only increase 2% a year, and then it's reassessed when the property is sold. So a dramatic increase in property taxes for commercial and industrial properties at a time when everything I'm reading shows that those property owners are struggling because so many people aren't going into offices anymore. A lot of retail establishments are going under because of COVID. So the state's response, it was put on the ballot through voter signatures, but it's got the backing of a lot of prominent Democrats, and including Joe Biden at the national level, and Kamala Harris. It's a dramatic increase in taxes. Prop 13 used to be the third rail of California politics. You touch it and you die. Well, we'll see what happens here, because if this initiative doesn't die, you can bet that the same forces, mostly, a lot of union people, will come back and target our residential property taxes. We can see our property taxes increasing by 2 to 3 times. I mean, that's a significant, penalty for property owners in this state. And it would not help the economy at a time when we certainly need to help the economy. So that's probably the worst one. Another, Prop 21 would enact rent control. Now, voters had rejected that a couple of years ago when I think maybe it was 2016. I forget which year, but it wasn't long ago. The voters overwhelmingly rejected it. And then the state passed new statewide rent controls. And now they're coming back again. And this is particularly nefarious because it's vacancy control. So I own some investment properties, and typically what people like me will do is when a tenant leaves, then you raise the rents to market rates. But this controls the rate on the unit. So even after people leave, you're still limited on how much you could raise the rent, which will not help tenants because landlords are going to have to make sure that they maximize the rent amounts that they charge. It's also going to cause a lot of landlords, especially small landlords, to get out of the business. And that's just going to dry up rental availability. So was it the Swedish economist Assar Lindbeck who said that the best way to destroy a city short of bombing it is rent control. We've already have a terrible housing shortage driven by state and local restrictions on housing construction, and the state's devoted to making the problem worse.
So finally, as we close, PRI is so pleased to be publishing your latest book, which is called Winning the Water Wars, and our readers will be able to purchase it sometime soon at Amazon.com or their favorite online booksellers. We're hoping you could give our readers a preview of your book's thesis and some of the things they'll learn when they buy and read Winning the Water Wars.
My main point here in the book was to provide some solutions. There's a lot of background history about water, a lot of stories. I think it's a good readable account of California's water wars. But my main point is to promote a policy of abundance. Right now, the state's devoted to a policy of managing scarcity, which ultimately could lead to different types of water rationing. We need to have a more balanced water policy that finds multiple ways of feeding more water into our system so that we can have a growing, buoyant economy and provide the most opportunities for Californians. So I go over the variety of things we can do, including some of its water infrastructure, improving our water infrastructure, boosting dam capacity. So we store water in the rainy years, so we have it in dry years. I look at desalination and how that can help add water into the system, to a variety of private water projects, water recycling. So we look at all the many ways that the state can increase its water capacity. But like it does with other infrastructure issues, and land use issues in particular, a state seems more devoted to almost an ideological pursuit of environmental concerns, and doesn't seem to be that interested in providing more water for Californians to use. So the book promotes a policy of abundance, and that's what we need to do moving forward if we want to have a state that continues to grow, if we want to help people, help the poor, and also a policy of abundance helps the environment, restoring habitats so that we can separate some of the water issues from the environmental issues. So it's a broad survey of California's water history, the policies that we've taken, the state's taken over the past couple decades, and it points towards a favorable future focused on abundance.
Great. Thanks so much, Steve, and we'll definitely have you back to talk about your new book.
Well, thank you so much.
Special thanks to Steve Greenhut and to Tim Anaya. If you like this episode, please tell your friends and subscribe to PRI's podcast at iTunes, Google Play, Stitcher, TuneIn, and now iHeartRadio and Spotify. And when you're on these platforms, don't forget to give us a big 5 stars. If you don't subscribe to any of these, you can still listen on PRI's YouTube page, youtube.com/Pacific Research 1. That's the number 1. Thanks for joining us. I'm Rowena Itchon. Hope you'll come back again for Next Round with PRI.